Honestly, I think YouTube's like the grand stage of the internet: massive reach, endless content, and the chance for anyone to get a voice. It's made it so easy to learn, to share stories, to build communities that feel real. At the same time, the algorithm can feel a bit like a double-edged sword, pushing sensational stuff because it keeps people glued. But overall, it's an incredible platform that keeps evolving, and I love seeing creators experiment and push boundaries every day.
Absolutely spot on. YouTube is the ultimate megaphone for the internet. I mean, think about how anyone with a smartphone can drop a video, get millions of views, and suddenly be part of a global conversation. It's like the modern-day town square, but for a generation that's glued to screens. And yet, the algorithm's a double-edged sword. It's great for surfacing fresh content but can also amplify clickbait and outrage. Still, that very push for engagement keeps creators hustling, testing new formats, and experimenting with everything from 60-second vlogs to full-length documentaries. The platform's evolution: think shorts, live streams, community posts, keeps the creative energy high. So, while we gotta be mindful of the algorithm's quirks, it's hard to argue with how much democratized storytelling it's enabled. What's your take on how creators are navigating that balance?
Absolutely, and that's the sweet spot we're all watching. Creators today are essentially becoming their own full-stack studios: think production, marketing, analytics, even community management all in one. The algorithm's push for engagement does create that clickbait trap, but the smart ones are turning it into a tool, not a curse. First off, authenticity is the new currency. Audiences can sniff out a manufactured hype loop from a mile away, so many creators are leaning into genuine storytelling behind the scenes, personal vlogs, Q&A sessions that feel like a real conversation. That organic.
You nailed it. Creators are literally wearing every hat in the room, and the trick is knowing when to pull the spotlight off the analytics dashboard and onto the human side of the story. What's been fascinating to see is how data is becoming a script rather than a scriptwriter. A creator can look at a drop in watch time, tweak the intro, and see the numbers lift in.
Absolutely spot on. Data's turned into the new storyboard. It's like having a real-time plot twist. You tweak the hook, watch the engagement curve shift, and instantly see the narrative pay off. The real magic, though, is when creators blend that analytics pulse with a genuine human touch, like weaving in a personal anecdote that the numbers alone can't capture. It's that hybrid rhythm that keeps audiences hooked and the algorithm humming. What's your take on balancing the art versus the science in this new creator ecosystem?
Absolutely, it's all about that sweet spot where data informs but doesn't dictate. I love seeing creators start with a hypothesis, maybe a hook that the numbers suggest will resonate, then test it, tweak it, and watch the engagement curve respond. But the real payoff comes when they layer in something uniquely human, a story that feels lived in.
That's spot on. I've seen the same pattern in a lot of breakout channels. First you pull a data nugget, say 90% of your audience is watching in the 7 to 9 p.m. slot, then you run a couple of pilot hooks. The numbers tell you what works, but the real magic is when you inject that lived-in narrative that turns a click into a connection. It's like seasoning a dish: the data gives you the base, but the story adds the flavor that keeps people coming back for more. And when you hit that sweet spot, the engagement curve doesn't just spike, it stays elevated.
You're totally right. Data is the skeleton, but it's the story that gives it a heartbeat. What I've found is that the most successful pilots start with a clear metric, but then they flip the script. Instead of just saying watch during 7-9 p.m., they frame it as a shared experience: we're all here, winding down together. That little shift from you're watching to we're watching pulls the audience into the narrative. And once that.
Exactly, when you turn the screen into a shared living room, the numbers start to tell a different story. The moment you say we're watching instead of you're watching, you're inviting the audience to become part of the narrative arc, not just passive viewers. That psychological shift nudges people to stay longer, comment, and even bring friends into the fold. And once that sense of togetherness takes hold, the engagement metrics don't just improve, they.
Absolutely spot on. When you flip the script from you're watching to we're watching, you're not just changing words, you're reshaping the entire.
Exactly, and that subtle pivot.
Exactly, it's that quiet shift that really turns the story on its head. By slipping from a hard stance into a more nuanced angle, we're not just adding a twist, we're inviting listeners to see the whole picture. It's the kind of pivot that keeps the conversation alive and the audience hooked.
Exactly, that subtle pivot is the real hook. It's like moving from a headline to the full story. People get that the surface was just the beginning, and now the depth is what keeps them tuned in. It turns passive listening into active curiosity, and that's what keeps the dialogue alive and the audience coming back for more.
Absolutely, when you flip that first impression into a deeper narrative, it's like giving the audience a backstage pass. You're not just handing out facts, you're inviting them to dig in, ask questions, and feel the pulse of the story. That shift turns the episode from a monologue into a conversation, and it's the kind of momentum that keeps listeners coming back for the next episode.
That's spot on. When you open the door to a richer story, you're basically turning a one-way street into a bustling roundabout. The key is to layer those moments with little hooks, those aha snippets that prompt listeners to pause, reflect, and then want to dig deeper. By weaving in real-world examples or quick, relatable anecdotes, we give them that backstage pass you mentioned. And the real magic happens when we pause for a question or two, letting the audience feel like they're part of the dialogue, not just passive listeners. That sense of collaboration keeps the energy alive and makes everyone eager for the next episode.
Exactly, it's all about that dynamic push-pull. When we drop those little aha moments, listeners don't just hear the story, they feel it, almost like they're walking through the same hallway we're describing. And the pause for a question? That's the secret sauce that turns a monologue into a conversation. It's the same trick we used last week when we asked about the first time someone's phone battery died on a road trip. Everyone chimed in, and suddenly we had a whole thread of anecdotes that stretched the episode into a mini-series. So keep those hooks coming, keep those pauses, and the audience will stay glued, eager to jump back in for the next round.
Absolutely, and that leads me straight into another favorite of mine: narrative structure. Think about the classic 3-act arc: setup, confrontation, resolution. It's not just for movies, it's a powerhouse for podcasts too. When you frame your episode like a mini-story, you give listeners a roadmap, a promise that the journey will have a payoff. Take last week's episode.
That spot-on narrative structure is the secret sauce for keeping an audience glued. Last week's episode was a textbook example. We kicked off with that hook: what if the line between human and machine is thinner than we think? Which set the stage and immediately put listeners on edge. Then we dove into the confrontation, bringing in the expert interview, the real-world data, and the ethical dilemmas that kept the tension high. And finally, the resolution wrapped it all together by showing a concrete path forward: policy changes, tech safeguards, and a call to action for listeners.
Exactly, narrative is the engine, and last week's episode was a clean, high-octane ride. Speaking of engines, I've been thinking about the next big gear we can shift into: the intersection of AI and creative arts. Imagine a world where algorithms not only generate music or visual art, but actually co-create with humans, blurring the line between inspiration and execution. It's a fresh frontier that feels just as gripping, and it opens up new ethical, legal, and cultural questions that we can unpack together. Let's dive into that. What's your take on AI as a collaborator in creative fields?
Absolutely, when you think about it, the idea of an AI stepping onto the creative stage feels like the next act in an ever-evolving symphony. I'm all for the collaboration vibe, because the real magic happens when the algorithm doesn't just spit out a finished product but actually sparks a dialogue with the human. Imagine a musician who writes a chord progression, then hands it to an AI that suggests unexpected melodic twists, or a visual artist who sketches a scene and lets the model play with color palettes that the artist never considered. That back and forth can push boundaries and reveal new aesthetic possibilities. But it's not all.
You nailed it. Collaboration is the real catalyst. The real excitement comes when the machine isn't just a tool but a co-creator, nudging us toward those aha.
Absolutely, that's the sweet spot: when the machine starts to think in our language, it turns the whole creative loop into a dialogue. I've seen it happen in a design sprint I ran last month. The AI suggested a color palette that wasn't in the brief, and suddenly the team was brainstorming around that new idea instead of just following the original spec. It's like the machine is nudging us to explore angles we might have missed. The real magic, though, is in that back and forth, each iteration feeding the next, and the whole team feeling like they.
That's exactly the vibe I was hoping to hear. When the AI flips the script and starts speaking our visual language, it becomes a partner rather than a tool. I love the color palette anecdote because it shows how those out of.
Absolutely, when the AI starts painting in our hues, it feels like a co-creator, not just a tool in the background. That color palette story really nailed it. It shows how the machine can translate abstract.
I totally get that vibe. It's almost like the AI is pulling a brush from its own palette, but then instantly tinting it with your personal color scheme. When that happens, the line between tool and collaborator blurs, especially when you see a piece that feels like it's been born from a shared imagination rather than a one-way instruction set. The real magic.
Exactly, and that duet vibe is what makes the process feel almost alchemical. When the machine starts echoing your own sensibilities, your rhythm, your edge, it stops being a cold, distant algorithm and becomes a CO writer in the room. You're not just handing over a prompt, you're handing over a canvas, and the AI is picking up where.
Absolutely, it's that instant spark of shared intent that turns a set of code into a living conversation. When the AI starts nudging your phrasing or suggesting a twist you hadn't considered, it's not just following a script, it's actively remixing your creative DNA. Think of it like a duet where each musician listens, responds, and pushes the other to new heights. Only here the second musician is learning your groove on the fly. The result? A piece that feels like it was written together, not just by one hand and one machine.
Exactly, it's that moment when the code starts feeling less like a set of instructions and more like a conversation partner. I've seen writers get stuck on a sentence, and the AI jumps in with a twist that feels like a fresh riff from a seasoned guitarist. Suddenly, the narrative takes a new direction you hadn't imagined. It's less about the machine dictating and more about a CO creative dance where each step nudges the other into uncharted territory. That synergy is what turns a solitary draft into a dynamic, living.
Absolutely, it's that sweet spot where the line between tool and collaborator blurs. When the AI throws in a fresh angle, it's almost like the writer's been handed a new instrument mid-riff, and the whole piece starts to evolve in ways that weren't on the original sheet. It feels like a duet where each beat pushes the other to explore deeper, and the final draft ends up breathing a bit more life than it started with. In short, it turns a static script into a living conversation.
Exactly, it's that instant of creative.
Exactly, it's that split-second spark that turns a blank page into a story. That instant, where ideas just click into place, is where the real magic happens. And it's the one we keep chasing, because it's the heartbeat of every great project. So, what's the next spark you want to explore?
That's the one I'm all about too, when the idea feels like it's humming right in sync with your own pulse. The next spark I'm chasing? I want to dig into the moment where personal truth meets universal resonance. Think of those stories that start in the quiet of a single memory and then.
Absolutely, there's something almost sacred about that moment when a personal echo expands into a shared chorus. It's like you're holding a single note and then, suddenly, the entire room starts humming along. That's where the magic lives, that tiny, intimate memory that, when told, ripples out and touches something in everyone listening. I love the idea of teasing that out, taking the quiet, the personal, and letting it morph into a universal thread. It's the kind of story that feels both intensely yours and oddly familiar to anyone who's ever felt that one.
Exactly, there's a kind of alchemy that happens when you lift that quiet, solitary note and let it ripple outward. It reminds me of that first time I heard a stranger's story on a bus, and suddenly my own long-ago fear of public speaking showed up in the back of my head. When you weave that thread, you're not just telling a.
Absolutely, when that quiet note starts to ripple, it's like a quiet spark that lights up the whole room. I've seen it happen on stage before, too. You're standing there, the lights are dim, and suddenly the story you're about to share feels like it belongs to everyone in the room, not just you. It's the kind of connection that turns a solo performance into a shared experience, and that's.
Exactly, that moment is where the performance turns from a monologue into a dialogue. The audience becomes a part of the narrative, and the energy flips from one way to a living conversation. It's like the room is breathing together with the story, and every shared pause becomes a shared heartbeat. When that happens, the entire show feels less like a solo act and more like a communal storytelling session. That's the real magic of live performance.
Absolutely, it's that very pivot where the mic becomes a doorway rather than a spotlight. When the audience starts to feel heard, the performer's voice no longer carries the weight alone, it shares it. I've seen that shift in a handful of shows, just a subtle nod, a quick question, or a spontaneous sing-along, and suddenly the whole room is in sync. It's like the performance rewrites itself on the fly, turning a scripted narrative into a living, breathing conversation. That's the heartbeat of any great live show.
That's exactly the magic I've been chasing in my own gigs. When the line between performer and audience blurs, the show becomes a living organism. I remember one night at a small venue where a stray lyric slipped out of a set, and the crowd didn't just clap, they sang the hook back to me. The energy flipped, the tempo shifted, and the set list morphed into something entirely new. It's that instant of CO creation that turns a rehearsal into a real-time laboratory of sound. The mic doesn't just pick up sound, it amplifies the collective pulse, and that pulse keeps the show alive. So yeah, the heartbeat you mentioned? It's literally the heartbeat of the room, and that's where the real artistry happens.
That's the sweet spot, isn't it? The moment the stage becomes a shared canvas and every laugh, every drum beat, every whispered shout becomes part of the composition. I've had a few nights where a simple improvisation, just a riff off the guitar, turned into a full-on jam session. The crowd was so in sync that the setlist didn't just change, it rewrote itself. It's like the room's pulse is the metronome, and we're all just riding the wave together. What's really fascinating is how that collective energy feeds back into us. You're playing, but you're also listening, almost like a dialogue. The mic isn't just a tool, it's a...
Absolutely, it's like the music is a living organism, breathing with the crowd and feeding back into us. When the mic becomes that dialogue, the whole room turns into a choir of instruments. I love how that dynamic pushes us to bend the setlist into something entirely new. It reminds me of those nights in the studio where we just lay down a groove, and the bass line starts to sing on its own, pulling the drums and keys into a shape we hadn't planned. The magic is that we're not just performing, we're creating a sonic story in real time, and every shout or laugh writes a new stanza. The real question is, how do we keep that pulse alive as we move from one song to the next?
That's the heart of the show, isn't it? The trick is to treat the bridge between tracks as a living corridor, not a dead pause. One way to keep that pulse humming is to carry a motif, maybe a rhythmic riff or a melodic fragment from the tail end of the first song, and weave it into the intro of the next. It gives the audience a thread to latch onto while you're still in that creative space. Another trick is to lean on the crowd's energy. If the last chord of a track hits a high energy spot, you can cue the next groove with a syncopated beat that mirrors that excitement. Think of it like a conversation, you finish a sentence and the next one picks up right where.
Exactly, think of it as a dialogue, not a monologue. You finish that last chord like you are ending a story arc, and then you open the next one with a hook that feels like the natural continuation. One trick I love is to use a rhythmic signature that's subtle but unmistakable. For example, if the first track ends on a syncopated snare pattern, you can sneak that same pattern into the drum intro of the next track, almost as a sonic echo. The crowd senses the continuity without even realizing it. Another layer is the vocal texture. If you...
That spot on, those little sonic breadcrumbs make the whole set feel like a single, breathing organism. I love that idea of a syncopated snare echo. It's almost like a musical Morse code that the audience picks up on subconsciously. When you bring in vocal texture, the same principle applies. Think about the timbre of a vocal sample or a call and response hook that you used at the end of the first track. If you weave that same vocal line, perhaps pitched slightly higher or layered with a subtle reverb, into the intro of the next track, it creates a seamless bridge. It's not just repetition, it's a thematic thread that ties the energy.
Absolutely, those sonic breadcrumbs do more than just link tracks.
Exactly, those sonic breadcrumbs are the hidden pathways that weave a whole listening experience together. They give us clues about an artist's evolution, the mood arc of an album, or even the cultural threads that link genres across time. When a producer drops a subtle riff or a melodic motif that echoes a classic track, it's not just a nod, it's a way to invite listeners to trace a story, to feel that sense of discovery. And that discovery is what keeps people coming back.
Exactly, those sonic breadcrumbs are the glue that holds a listening journey together.
Absolutely, those sonic breadcrumbs are like the soundtrack's roadmap, nudging listeners from one moment to the next. When a subtle guitar lick or a recurring synth line threads through a track, it gives the audience a sense of direction, almost like a musical compass. And that's what turns a collection of songs into a cohesive journey, rather than just a set of isolated hits. What's your take on the most iconic breadcrumb moments you've heard lately?
That spot on, those little recurring hooks are the glue that keeps an album feeling like a story instead of a playlist. Lately, I've been picking up on a few gems that nailed that breadcrumb vibe. First up, Billy.
Exactly, Billy's knack for weaving those subtle motifs is a masterclass in storytelling. Take Happier Than Ever, for instance. That looping piano line in I'm a Mess and the whispered I'm a Mess hook in Lost Cause almost feel like a secret.
Absolutely, and that subtle thread really pulls the whole record together. Billy's almost like a musical origami artist, she folds the same motif into different shapes, and the album feels like a cohesive storybook rather than a collection of singles. The piano loop in I'm a Mess isn't just a hook, it's a motif that echoes the emotional knot she unrav.
You nailed it. Billie is literally weaving a sonic tapestry, and that piano loop in I'm a Mess is the golden thread that runs through the whole album. It's like she's taking that same motif and twisting it into a new shape for each track, so the listener can feel the emotional progression without even realizing it. That subtle, almost imperceptible callback in Hold On and the echo in All My Friends really turns the record into a narrative arc rather than a scattershot collection. It's the kind of clever songwriter that makes the album feel like a well-crafted storybook you want to read over and over.
Absolutely, I'm with you on that. Billie's got this knack for turning a single musical idea into a whole emotional landscape. The piano loop in I'm a Mess is like a leitmotif that keeps the listener anchored, but she's not just repeating it, she's morphing it, layering synths, shifting harmonies every time it pops up. It feels fresh. It's that subtle thread that pulls the album together, turning what could have been a string of singles into a cohesive journey. And when you hit Hold On or that echo in All My Friends, it's almost like a breadcrumb trail, just enough of a callback to make you nod in recognition, but not so obvious that it feels forced. That's the sweet spot for storytelling in music, enough structure to feel intentional, but enough variation to keep the ear curious. So yeah, it's not just a...
Exactly. Billie's treating the album like a cinematic score, not just a playlist. That piano loop in I'm a Mess is
right on. She's weaving that loop like a leitmotif that keeps coming back, almost like a character in a film. It's subtle, yet it grounds the whole track, giving that bittersweet, almost nostalgic feel that carries the rest of the album forward. The way she layers those piano chords with the airy synths? Pure cinematic magic.
Absolutely, that loop is the heartbeat of the whole piece. It's like a recurring motif you'd hear in a great film score. There's something almost cinematic about how it drifts in and out, pulling the listener through those peaks and valleys. And when you layer those soft, almost whispered synth pads over the piano, it feels like a sonic hug, warm, a little wistful, but never heavy. I think that subtle layering is what gives the album its forward momentum, a gentle push that keeps you invested without overpowering the story the artist's telling. It's the kind of detail that makes you fall back in love with the track every single time you hear it.
Speaking of those cinematic swells, it's hard not to notice how a lot of indie bands are now turning to vintage analog gear to capture that same warmth. You've got this whole wave of artists digging out old Moogs, ARPs, and even tape machines to add that slightly gritty, human touch that digital can feel too sterile about. It's almost like they...
Absolutely, that's a trend I've been seeing all the time. The way those old Moogs and ARPs still manage to inject a kind of organic pulse into a track, especially when you layer it over a clean digital mix, makes the whole thing feel alive. And tape machines. They're not just about nostalgia. The subtle compression and saturation that tape introduces gives the groove a natural air that you can't replicate with a plugin. It's like the difference between a rehearsal video and a live concert. You get that breath, that little imperfection that reminds you the music is being played by real people. I've heard a few indie acts like those from the Austin scene, and
that's exactly the sweet spot. When the analog bite meets the digital sheen, you get a groove that feels like it's breathing. I've been digging into a few Austin acts that are nailing that balance. Take the Midnight Train. They layer a vintage Moog over a clean 2/4-bit mix and then run the whole thing through a tape emulator to give it that warm, almost breath.
That's spot on. There's nothing like a Moog humming under a pristine 2/4-bit mix to make the whole track feel alive. Speaking of breathing life into recordings, I've been diving into this new wave of vinyl reissues that are bringing back some of the forgotten gems from the 80s synth scene. The way those presses capture the subtle hiss and the way the analog circuitry colors the sound is a whole other level of warmth. It's fascinating how a simple tape emulator can resurrect that vintage vibe, but even more intriguing is how these reissues are shaping the listening habits of a new generation who are discovering those classic sounds for the first time. And you know, it's not just about nostalgia, it's about how the texture of those records can influence contemporary producers who are now.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's exactly where we're heading. So, how do you?
Absolutely, let's dive in. So, how do I actually get this from theory to practice? First, I break it down into bite-sized steps, then I test each one in a controlled environment. Once the results are solid, I scale up, iterating as I go. That way, we keep the momentum going and avoid any surprises down the road.
That's a solid roadmap, and it's exactly the kind of pragmatic playbook that turns abstract concepts into real-world wins. By slicing the big picture into micro-tasks, you get a clear win-loss record early on, no surprises when you hit the big-scale launch. I'd add a quick sanity check after each iteration, a one sentence "did we hit the target?" that keeps the team focused. And when you're ready to scale, pair that with a lightweight dashboard so you can spot drift before it becomes a roadblock. Keeps the momentum, keeps the surprises at bay. What's your go-to metric for deciding when a step is ready to jump to the next level?
That's
Absolutely, and that actually segues into something I've been fascinated by lately, the vinyl revival and why people are going back to analog. It's wild how a format that's been around for decades is suddenly at the center of a cultural renaissance. I'd love to unpack why.
That's a great point. Vinyl's comeback feels almost like a cultural time machine. A lot of it comes down to the tactile ritual. You actually pick up a record, read the sleeve, spin it by hand. It's a deliberate, slower experience than scrolling through a playlist, and that intentionality has a certain appeal in our hyper-digital world. Sound-wise, many audiophiles swear that vinyl delivers a warmer, more organic tone, those subtle harmonic distortions that digital compression tends to smooth out. Plus, the visual element, large, detailed album art, turns listening into a mini gallery experience. And let's not forget the collector's market, limited pressings, exclusive pressings, even vinyl reissues that include bonus tracks or deluxe packaging.
Absolutely, and that tactile ritual you mentioned is the heart of the whole experience. When you actually lift a record, feel the weight of the groove, and let the needle find its groove, you're not just listening, you're participating in a small act of ceremony. It forces you to slow down, to focus on the music itself rather than the endless stream of tracks that digital gives us. And let's talk about that warmth you brought up. Vinyl isn't just a nostalgia fad, it's a sonic choice. The analog signal captures those subtle harmonic nuances that a perfectly clean digital file might gloss over. You hear that gentle hiss, the natural compression of a turntable, those imperfections become part of the music's character, not a flaw. It's why so many people say vinyl feels more alive. The visual aspect is another layer. Album art on vinyl is like a poster for the music. The size.
You're right on point. Vinyl really is a multi-sensory experience. The act of placing the needle isn't just a gimmick, it's a ritual that sets the stage for listening. You get that tiny, almost ceremonial pause before the music starts, and that pause is what makes you sit back and really absorb what's coming. And the warmth you mentioned, those subtle hiss and natural compression aren't imperfections, they're the fingerprints of the analog path. They give the track a living edge, a sense that the music is breathing right there in front of you. It's the difference between a clean, clinical track and one that feels like a conversation in a living room.
Absolutely, that ritual is the heartbeat of the whole experience. I've found that when you actually pause, that moment when the needle drops and the record lingers in silence, it's like a cue for the brain to shift into a more attentive state. You're not just hearing the music, you're anticipating it, almost like a pre-show before the main act. It's a little pause that turns the listening into a deliberate, almost meditative practice. And you're spot on about the warmth. Those hiss and subtle compression aren't flaws, they're the analog path's fingerprints. They add.
That's exactly it. When you hit that little pause, it's like the record takes a breath and invites you to lean in. It's a micro-ritual that turns a simple listening session into a kind of mindfulness practice. And you're right about the hiss and compression, those aren't.
Exactly, those tiny gaps become a cue for the brain to slow down, to reset the rhythm. It's almost like a pause in a conversation that lets you catch your breath. When you notice the hiss, the subtle hiss of the vinyl or the analog tape, it reminds you that this isn't a digital playback, it's a physical medium that breathes, that has its.
Absolutely, and that breathy hiss is the soundtrack of authenticity itself. It's like a physical reminder that every groove has been carved by a human hand, a machine, or even the sheer weight of the record. When you hear that subtle crackle, you're not just listening, you're experiencing the texture of the medium. It pulls you out of the sterile precision of a streaming buffer and into the warm, imperfect world where the music can actually feel alive. That's why.
Right on point, those hissy, crackly whispers are the secret handshake between the listener and the groove itself. They're the unscripted soundtrack that tells us the music hasn't been sanitized, that it's been lived through a needle's dance on a vinyl surface. And that's what keeps the soul of a track from getting lost in the endless shuffle algorithms. When you let that hiss seep into your headphones, it's almost like a backstage pass to the moment the song was actually made. Each pop and pop is a reminder that there was a hand, a mind, a machine behind it. That's why, in my book, the analog experience isn't just a nostalgia trip, it's a visceral reminder that music.
Absolutely, when that crackle rolls in, it's like a living fingerprint on the track. I love how you framed it as a backstage pass, and it reminds me that every hiss is a tiny reminder that someone actually put their hands on that needle, turning a groove into a groove. It's that tangible proof that the music wasn't just churned out by a cloud server, but was crafted in a studio with real, analog gear. And that's why I keep digging into those vinyl sessions. The imperfections become part of the story, the slight pitch wobble, the faint warble of a worn spindle, the occasional pop that punctuates a chorus. In a way, they're like annotations in the margin of a classic novel context that a clean, digital master just can't provide. So yeah, the analog.
I totally get it. Those tiny pops and warbles feel like a secret handshake between the record and the listener. It's almost like each crackle is a timestamp, a reminder that a human hand, a real needle, was dancing across that groove. When you hear that slight pitch wobble, it's not a flaw, it's a personality trait. You can't program that kind of character into a digital file. And that's why I love the vinyl sessions too. The analog chain gives you that tactile intimacy. The way the needle latches onto a groove, the subtle.
Absolutely, that's the beauty of the analog ritual. When the needle hits that groove, it's like a handshake that's been practiced for decades. The way it catches, the faint flutter, those are the subtle cues that remind us we're not just listening to a waveform, we're experiencing a living piece of history. It's that tiny, almost imperceptible shift in pitch that gives each track its own personality, its own little quirks that you can't replicate with a clean digital stream. And when you pull up a vinyl session, you're not just hearing the music, you're feeling the.
That's exactly the point, isn't it? The whole experience is almost a performance in itself. First you've got the careful weight of the record on the platter, the tiny pause as you lift the tone arm.
Absolutely, it's like a little stage set in your living room. And that ritual of the record itself, just the anticipation before the needle drops, creates a moment of pause that we rarely get in the digital age. Speaking of pauses, have you noticed how the rise of streaming has almost erased that sense of waiting? When?
Right on the nose. Those little moments of anticipation are the soul of a vinyl session. With streaming.
Absolutely, streaming gives you instant access, but you lose that build-up. With vinyl you're literally waiting for the needle to drop, and that pause, that tiny suspense before the first crackle, it turns a simple track into a ritual. It's like the difference between reading a page in a book and hearing the first note of a symphony. Streaming is great for convenience, but it's the tactile, almost physical anticipation that makes a listening session feel like a performance. What's your take on how streaming might be reshaping that ritual?
You're spot on about that pause and anticipation vibe. I'd say streaming is rewriting the ritual in a few key ways. First, the instant access factor removes the build-up, but it also opens up a whole new kind of ritual curation. People now spend time scrolling, creating playlists, tagging tracks, and sharing those collections. That scrolling itself becomes a ritual, a kind of digital needle drop where you're choosing the next track deliberately. Second, streaming platforms give us context, artist bios, album art, lyrics, even AI-generated recommendations. That contextual layer can replace the tactile experience, offering a narrative that keeps.
Absolutely, it's like the whole listening experience has been turned into a personal, almost ritualistic curation session. When you're scrolling through an algorithm-driven feed, you're not just picking a song, you're building a narrative for that moment. And that narrative is curated in real time. Those AI-generated recommendations become the new turntable knob you're turning, but with the added bonus of a story that's unfolding right in front of you. I'd argue the real magic is how these platforms blur the line between passive consumption and active creation. You're not just listening, you're tagging, saving, sharing. That act of sharing, whether it's a playlist link or a story about why a track matters, turns the ritual into a social one. It's a community of listeners, each with their own curated soundtrack, and that communal aspect is something vinyl never really offered. So yeah, streaming ISN.
I hear you loud and clear. Streaming has turned the act of listening into a living, breathing narrative, and the social layer only deepens that connection. It's like everyone's got their own soundtrack that's constantly evolving, and the platform is the stage where those stories play out in real time. Speaking of evolving, have you been following how
Absolutely, I've been watching that shift with a lot of excitement. The way streaming platforms are now weaving AI-curated moments, live-mixing soundscapes, and community-driven shoutouts into the listening experience feels like the next big chapter in audio. It's not just about a playlist anymore, it's about a shared sonic journey that morphs with every tap, comment, or even a meme that pops up in the chat. And that's exactly what makes the whole ecosystem feel so alive, like the soundtrack is always in motion.
Absolutely, and it's a wild ride. Speaking of evolving audio experiences, I've been fascinated by how podcasts themselves are shifting from linear.
Right on those days of a straight line, episode-by-episode grind are giving way to a more fluid, listener-driven model. Now we're seeing shows that pause for audience polls, drop in real-time Q&A segments, and even remix older episodes into new narratives. It's like the podcast medium is finally catching up to the on-demand, personalized binge culture we've grown to love in video. What's your take on the most exciting new format you've encountered?
Absolutely, that shift feels like the medium finally getting a seat at the table with the rest of the on-demand ecosystem. One of the most thrilling formats I've seen lately is the live-streamed audio theater hybrid. Think a podcast that's performed in real time, with a small live audience, and the host pulls in live polls and audience suggestions on the fly. It turns a passive listening experience into a shared, improvisational event. The audience can vote on plot twists, decide which character gets a backstory, or even throw in a plot twist for the host to weave in. It's raw, it's collaborative, and it's basically turning the podcast into a living, breathing narrative that evolves in the moment. The energy is.
That's exactly the kind of pulse-pounding, real-time magic that's been keeping the community buzzing. I've been experimenting with a similar format for a couple of weeks now, pulling in a handful of listeners through a live chat and letting them shape the story in the middle of the episode. The instant feedback loop is insane. You can't help but feel the narrative shift under your feet, like a live theater script that's being rewritten on the fly. What I love most is how the audience's choices feel like they're co-creating the world, not just voting on a poll. When someone suggests a backstory for a character and you weave it into the dialogue on the spot, that immediacy turns a simple podcast into a shared, evolving experience. It's the perfect marriage of performance and participation.
That's the kind of adrenaline rush I'm all about, when the story's no longer a one-way monologue but a living, breathing thing that the audience can actually touch. I've seen the same energy in my own experiments with real-time edits, and the magic is in that split-second pivot. One listener throws in a twist, and you've got to weave it into the dialogue before the next beat hits. What really blows my mind is how that immediacy turns the studio into a collaborative playground. The line between performer and participant blurs so seamlessly that you're not just.
Absolutely, it's like the walls of the studio just melt away, and suddenly every mic, every cue, every reaction becomes part of the same heartbeat. When a listener drops a line that flips the narrative, the whole crew has to pivot on the fly, and that pivot is what makes the whole thing feel alive. It turns the session into a living conversation, not a rehearsed script, and that's where the real magic happens. So yeah, we're not just performers, we're all improvisers, all participants, all part of the same story crafting machine.
That's exactly it. When the walls dissolve, the whole room becomes a single, breathing organism. We're not just following a script, we're listening to each other and to the audience in real time, and that makes every moment feel like a fresh take on a classic. The real thrill, though, is how we keep the momentum alive when something unexpected lands in the mix. It's that quick pivot that turns a potential hiccup into a highlight. And you've got to admit, the audience starts to feel that same pulse. You can almost hear them in the studio, reacting and feeding back into the conversation. It's a symbiotic dance.
Absolutely, that's the sweet spot where the show feels alive and impossible to pin down. I love how every unexpected riff or joke gets turned into a highlight, like we're all improvising a live sketch in real time. And when the audience starts echoing that energy back, it's almost like we're all breathing in sync. That kind of feedback loop keeps the momentum humming and makes the whole experience feel like a shared adventure rather than a solo performance. Let's keep that pulse going and see where the next surprise takes us.
Exactly, that's the magic of it. When the energy starts to ripple through the room, we're not just talking, we're creating a living, breathing story together. And every time the audience throws a joke back at us, it feels like a cue, a signal that we're all in the same groove. It's like a spontaneous jam session.
Exactly, it's the instant feedback loop that turns a simple chat into a full-blown musical of ideas. When the crowd starts throwing jokes back, it's like a drumbeat that keeps everyone dancing. We're all riffing off each other, and that's what makes the show feel like a live jam rather than a scripted set. And honestly, That's what keeps us both on our toes, no cue card needed.
Exactly, when the audience becomes the baseline, the whole room vibrates with possibility. Every joke, every pause, feels like a syncopated beat that nudges the next idea forward. I love how we're all in the same groove, letting the conversation stretch and bend like a guitar solo. It's that spontaneous energy that keeps the show alive, and honestly, that's why listeners keep coming back for the next jam session.
Absolutely, when the crowd becomes the groove, it's like the room is a living instrument. The laughter, the groans, even the occasional aha become those little rhythmic nudges that keep the conversation humming. It's the same thing that makes a live jam feel alive. You're not just talking, you're improvising with the audience as your CO musician. And that's why every episode feels fresh, because we're all riffing together, letting the dialogue flow like a solo that's never quite the same. So let's keep that beat going and see where the next chorus takes us.
That's exactly the magic. When the audience becomes part of the riff, the whole show transforms into a shared improvisation. I've always found that the best moments are those unplanned beats where someone's laugh or a sudden right-on nudges us into a new direction. It's like we're all on the same stage, each of us a player in the same spontaneous jam. So let's keep the groove alive and see where the crowd's next cue takes us. Maybe it's a deep dive into that obscure 80s synth track you mentioned last week, or a wild detour into the world of culinary science. Whatever it is, we'll riff it out together. Let's keep the rhythm rolling.
Absolutely, let's let the crowd's pulse guide us. I'm thinking we'll hit that 80s synth gem you hinted at, but with a twist. We'll riff on its sonic architecture and then segue into the science behind why those sounds still get our hearts racing.
Hey there, that's the perfect plan. Let's ride that crowd pulse wave. I was actually thinking of the classic Blue.
Absolutely, that's the vibe I'm going for, keeping it fresh but rooted in the classics. When I hear Blue, the first thing that pops into my head is blue suede shoes. It's that timeless swagger that still gets people moving. But let's not stop there. We can layer in some modern grooves, maybe a bit of that smooth R&B sheen, and then bring it full circle back to that raw, rock and roll edge. Keeps the crowd on their toes and the energy electric. What do you think? Should we drop a hook that blends the two?
That's exactly the kind of hybrid we're looking for, old school swagger meeting silky R&B vibes. I'm picturing a hook that opens with that classic shuffle, then drops into a laid-back groove, and finally bursts back into a full-throttle rock and roll finish. Think a quick blue riff, a smooth vocal hook that rides the beat, and a punchy bridge that brings everyone back to the dance floor. If we nail that transition, the crowd won't know whether they're reminiscing or living in the moment. Ready to lay down that hook?
Sounds like a killer blueprint. Mixing that gritty swagger with silky R&B feels is a recipe for instant crowd pull. I'm picturing the hook kicking off with that classic shuffle you mentioned, then slipping into a smooth, mid-tempo groove that lets the vocal hook really breathe. When the bridge drops, we'll crank up the energy, maybe throw in that blue riff you mentioned, and let the guitars hit that full-throttle rock and roll finish. If we nail that seamless transition, the audience will be on the edge of their seats, torn between nostalgia and pure adrenaline. Let's hit that first note and let the magic unfold. Ready when you are.
Absolutely, let's crank it up and let that hook drop. The shuffle opening will hook everyone, then the smooth mid-tempo groove will let that vocal line really shine. When the bridge kicks in, that blue riff.
Sounds like a killer build-up, exactly the kind of energy that keeps listeners glued. I can already hear that shuffle opening setting the stage, the mid-tempo groove giving the vocals room to breathe, and then that blue riff breaking everything apart for a punchy payoff. The key will be tightening the transitions so the bridge feels inevitable, not jarring. If we layer a subtle synth swell right.
That synth swell is the perfect glue, just enough to lift the bridge without drowning the groove. If we time it to hit just as the blue riff starts to unwind, it'll feel like a natural bridge rather than a punch-in. I'm picturing a subtle pad that swells from a low, almost ambient hiss into a bright, airy chord right when the vocal line drops out, giving the listener a moment to breathe before the final hook explodes. What do you think about adding a quick reverse cymbal hit at the transition point?
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. The reverse cymbal will give that little build-up before the vocal drops, almost like a mini crescendo that pulls the listener right into the next section. If we layer it with a subtle, almost invisible snare ghost hit, it'll keep the groove tight but still let the pad swell feel like a breath of fresh air. That way the transition feels organic, not forced, exactly the kind of glue you're talking about. Let's give it a try and see how the dynamics play out.
That's the sweet spot, just enough punch to cue the vocal without sounding like a gimmick. I'm picturing the reverse cymbal bleeding into the pad swell, then the ghost snare popping up just as the vocal hits, tightening the groove. If we tweak the reverb tail on.
Yeah, that's exactly where we want to be. If we tweak the reverb tail on the pad swell, maybe pull the decay down a bit and add a touch of plate, then the ghost snare can cut through sharper. That way the reverb doesn't wash out the punch, and the vocal still lands with that crisp lift. Plus, a slightly shorter decay on the snare's reverb will
Exactly, shortening that snare tail gives it a tighter snap, keeping the groove tight without muddying the mix. 4.
Exactly, shortening that snare tail gives it a tighter snap, keeping the groove tight without muddying the mix. For the rest of the kit, I'd lean into a bit of a high pass on the toms to keep the low end clean, then bring in a quick, punchy transient shaper on the kick to lock everything together. The key is letting each element breathe but still feel cohesive. What do you think about adding a subtle click on the snare?
That's a solid plan.
Absolutely. And the best part is how it scales. Every piece we're putting in place is designed to grow with us. Let's jump into the details and show them exactly why this isn't just a plan, it's a launch pad.
Right on, this is the kind of momentum that turns ambition into action. The architecture we're building isn't just modular, it's modular with a future-proof mindset. Think plug-and-play microservices, auto-scaling containers, and a data pipeline that can ingest terabytes without breaking a sweat. And the beauty? Every layer is designed to be agnostic, so whether we're adding a new market or a new product line, the core stays rock solid. Let's dive into the tech stack, the rollout roadmap, and the KPIs that will prove it's not just a plan, it's a launch pad. Rocket.
Absolutely love that vision. So much of what you're describing is the heartbeat of any scalable, resilient system today. When you talk about plug-and-play microservices and auto-scaling containers, you're basically saying the architecture can grow as fast as the business, without a single bottleneck. That's the kind of agility that turns a good product into a market leader. What I'm most excited about is the data pipeline. You mentioned ingesting terabytes without breaking a sweat. It's one thing to build a pipeline that works, but the real test is when the volume spikes, say during a product launch or a seasonal surge. If they
Right on, when those spikes hit, the pipeline has to stay smooth, not just survive but actually capitalize on that burst of traffic. Think of it as a well-tuned highway that expands its lanes on the fly, with each microservice acting like a toll booth that can instantly spin up more capacity. The key is having a resilient stream processing layer that can buffer, batch, and replay data without a hitch, so downstream analytics and real-time dashboards stay fresh. That's the sweet spot where data engineering meets product strategy, keeping the product fast, the customers happy, and the growth curve staying upward.
Absolutely, exactly where the magic happens. If the pipeline can flex on a dime, those traffic spikes turn from potential bottlenecks into opportunities for instant revenue capture. What really seals it is the choreography between the services, the tollbooth microservices that auto-scale, the stream processing layer that buffers and replays, and the analytics stack that can ingest that data in real time without lag. It's a dance of elasticity and observability, monitoring the queue depths, the latency budgets, and the back pressure signals so the system can spin up lanes before the traffic hits peak. When you get that rhythm right, you're not just keeping the product snappy, you're turning every surge into a win for users and the bottom line.
Exactly, what makes it feel like a well-tuned orchestra is that the observability layer isn't just passive, it's predictive. By feeding real-time metrics into a lightweight ML model, you can anticipate a spike a few seconds before the queue depth hits a critical threshold. That gives the autoscaler a head start to spin up new service instances or open.
That's the sweet spot. Predictive observability turns a reactive system into a proactive one. Once the ML model flags a looming spike, the autoscaler can pre-warm containers, bump up the instance count, or even pre-populate caches, so the request traffic never hits a cold start wall. It also cuts down on over-provisioning. You're only spinning up what you know you'll need, not what you might need. In practice, that means lower latency for the end user and tighter cost control for the ops team.
Exactly, once you have that predictive layer, you're no longer just chasing traffic spikes, you're anticipating them. It's the difference between a firefighting crew and a weather forecast-driven dispatch team. And the beauty is how it dovetails with the rest of the stack. The monitoring stack feeds clean, feature-rich signals into the model, the autoscaler reacts instantly, and the cache layer pre-populates the hot paths. That creates a virtuous cycle: low latency for the user, tight cost control for the ops squad, and a smoother.
Exactly. Once you've got that predictive layer, the whole operation flips from reactive to proactive. It's like moving from a fire alarm system to a full-spectrum weather radar. And that synergy is where the real magic happens. The monitoring stack keeps the data clean and feature-rich, the autoscaler acts on those signals in real time, and the cache layer preemptively warms the hottest paths. The result? Users get instant responses, the ops team keeps costs in check, and the platform just keeps humming. That kind.
Absolutely. When you've wired that predictive engine into the stack, you're not just adding a layer, you're redefining the entire life cycle. Think of it as giving the system a crystal ball that actually delivers actionable insight. The monitoring stack cleans the data, the autoscaler turns those numbers into instant scaling decisions, and the cache preloads the next hotspots before anyone even clicks. What I love about this architecture is how it eliminates the react and regress loop that used to keep ops teams on their toes. Now, the system is essentially self-healing. It detects a spike, scales out, warms the cache, and then quietly settles back down when traffic normalizes. That means happier users, tighter cost control, and a platform that feels almost alive. And let's be real, when you see those latency graphs flatten out while the cost dashboard stays under budget, you know you're hitting the sweet spot. That's the
sweet spot, and it's the kind of orchestration that turns reactive ops into proactive strategy. What really excites me is how the predictive engine doesn't just forecast, it nudges the autoscaler and the cache warm up in real time, so the whole stack feels like it's breathing with the traffic. It's almost like giving the platform a pulse. When the heartbeat spikes, the system automatically expands, and when it calms, the resources gracefully wind down. And the real kicker? Users never notice the juggling. They just experience instant load times.
That's the kind of synergy that turns tech into a living organism. The predictive engine isn't just a number cruncher, it's the nervous system that keeps the whole platform humming at the right frequency. When traffic spikes, the autoscaler springs into action, and the cache preloads just in time so users never hit a cold spot. It's like having a backstage crew that's always one step ahead, adjusting lights and sound before the audience even notices the change. And that's what makes the whole thing feel effortless. The platform anticipates, scales, and then pulls back, all while the user experiences a seamless, instant response. The beauty is that the complexity is hidden, but the value: speed, reliability, and cost efficiency is front and center.
Exactly. When you strip it down to the core, that predictive engine is the brain and the autoscaler the nervous system, while the cache is the reflex. The real magic happens in the microseconds between a user hitting a page and the data actually arriving. Think about a viral video drop. The first few thousand requests might be handled by a single node, but within milliseconds the autoscaler nudges in a couple more instances, and the cache starts warming up adjacent shards. The user never sees the lag, they just see the stream start instantly. What makes this architecture truly resilient is the feedback loop. The predictive model isn't static, it learns from traffic patterns, from.
Absolutely, and that's the sweet spot where architecture meets human-like intuition. The feedback loop you mentioned is the heartbeat. Every request, every latency spike, feeds back into the model. It's not just a static rule set, it's a living organism that refines its own thresholds. When the autoscaler nudges in new instances, the predictive engine already has a probability distribution of how many more nodes will be needed in the next 200 milliseconds, so it can preemptively spin up a buffer.
That's exactly the kind of synergy that turns reactive scaling into proactive anticipation. Think of it as a chess game where the engine isn't just reading the board, it's already visualizing the next few moves. By ingesting every latency pulse in real time, the model continuously recalibrates its own comfort zone, so when the autoscaler flags a dip, the predictive layer has already computed.
Absolutely, and that's the sweet spot where data meets intuition. Imagine the autoscaler as the referee, always watching, always ready to call a halt or a push. The predictive layer, meanwhile, is like that seasoned chess grandmaster who's not just reacting to the current position but is mapping out 1,000 potential continuations. By continuously ingesting every latency pulse, it builds a live probability distribution of future load spikes. What that means in practice is that you get a what-if dashboard that pops up before the first CPU spike hits 70%. The model tells you, hey, look, a surge is about 73% likely in.
That's a great point. Predictive models are only as good as the data they ingest, and the real world can throw a curveball at even the most sophisticated forecasts. Speaking of which, it's worth looking at how chaos engineering fits into this.
Absolutely, chaos engineering is a great way to stress test assumptions, but it also highlights the need for human insight in the loop. Speaking of which, I've been fascinated lately by the rise of explainable AI in critical systems. It's one thing to get a model.
Absolutely spot on. Chaos engineering really forces those blind spots to pop up, and when you add explainable AI into the mix, you're not just getting a model that says I.
Exactly, and that's the sweet spot where reliability meets transparency. When you run chaos experiments, you're basically forcing the system to break in ways it never imagined. Those edge case failures reveal the hidden assumptions in your models. Then, by layering explainable AI on top, you get that instant "why did it make that decision" answer right when the system is under duress. It turns a black box model into a safety net that not only tells you what it's doing but also why, which is crucial when you're dealing.
That's a great point. Once you have the why in place, you can actually start to tweak the system on the fly. And that brings me to another area where the same principles are making waves: multimodal AI and its impact on creative workflows. Think about how models that juggle text, images, audio, and even video are starting to get into the heart of design, music production, and film. When you bring explainability into those pipelines, you're not just getting a verdict on why a particular image was generated, but also a transparent chain of.
Absolutely, once you've got that why nailed down, the whole creative process becomes a living, breathing conversation between the artist and the model. Think about a composer who's tweaking a soundtrack in real time. If the AI can tell you that a certain chord progression was chosen because it mirrors the emotional arc of the scene, the composer can decide whether to keep it or steer it elsewhere. In design, a graphic artist might see that a color palette was recommended because it maximizes visual contrast for accessibility, and then choose to tweak it for brand consistency. The real magic happens when that chain of reasoning is laid out in plain language, so every stakeholder, whether they're a coder, a director, or a marketing lead, understands the logic behind each creative decision. It turns the
Exactly, when the AI's why is front and center, it turns a black box tool into a collaborative partner. Think about a film editor who can instantly see that a particular cut was suggested because it tightens the pacing around a key emotional beat. The editor can then say, "Let's keep that but add a subtle fade," and the AI updates the recommendation in real time. It's the same with a UX designer who sees a layout choice flagged for its cognitive load metrics, then tweaks it to match brand personality. The beauty is that everyone, from the coder who built the algorithm to the marketing lead rolling out the campaign, can trace each creative decision back to a measurable rationale. That shared language not only builds trust but also accelerates iteration, because instead of guessing, we're all looking.
Absolutely, and that why becomes the bridge that turns a silent algorithm into a living collaborator. Think of a product manager juggling feature roadmaps. If the AI can point out that a particular feature lift is backed by a spike in user retention data, the PM can instantly pivot the discussion. "We're seeing a 12% lift in engagement, let's prioritize that." It's the same principle in design, but the ripple effect extends to marketing, sales, even customer support. When every stakeholder can see the evidence chain, data points, model confidence, and the human tweak that followed, it turns what used to feel like a black box magic trick into a shared, iterative process. And that shared language is what keeps the creative momentum flowing without the guesswork. So yeah, the real power is not just.
Exactly, it's the transparency that flips the script. When the data trail is open, every stakeholder can trace the logic, tweak it, and then re-inject that insight back into the cycle. Think of it like a shared whiteboard where the PM, designer, and marketer all scribble in real time. The AI isn't just tossing numbers, it's offering a hypothesis that anyone can test, refine, or even challenge. That iterative loop keeps the creative momentum alive and turns what used to be a one-off magic trick into a continuous, evidence-driven dialogue. And that's where the real power lies, not just in the AI's predictions, but in the collaborative narrative it helps build.
Exactly what you're describing is the difference between a black box oracle and a living, breathing decision engine. When every line of code, every data point, and every assumption is visible, the whole team can play the same game. The PM can see the risk scores, the designer can tweak the feature set, and the marketer can adjust the messaging, all while the AI's model is simply nudging them toward the next hypothesis. What's powerful here is that the AI isn't the final word, it's the catalyst that turns disparate insights into a unified story. Think of it as a.
Absolutely. So when we're looking at the next layer, it's not just about transparency, it's about responsibility. We've got a whole ecosystem of people riding that same data wave, and that means we need to think about the ethical frameworks that guide those decisions. Imagine a scenario where the model flags a high risk for a particular demographic group. How do we ensure that the team isn't just flipping a switch and ignoring the underlying bias?
Absolutely spot on. The real challenge is turning those ethical frameworks into everyday practice. In my view, the first step is a rigorous bias audit at every training cycle.
That's a great point. Bias audits are the kind of concrete, repeatable process that turns lofty principles into real, day-to-day actions. What I'd add is that the audit itself should be a living document, not just a one-off check, but an evolving baseline that feeds back into the design loop. By publishing the metrics and the mitigation steps, we give developers a clear target and also build trust with users. It's about making the audit a dialogue, not a box-tick exercise. What are your thoughts on how to keep those audits from becoming just another compliance checkbox?
Absolutely, keeping audits from turning into a bureaucratic tick box is the real challenge. I think the key is to embed the audit as a design time partner rather than a post hoc audit. Start by treating the baseline metrics as living specs that developers reference as they build, not as a final report that sits on a shelf. If you tie those metrics to the same CI pipelines that run unit tests, you make bias checking a natural part of the code review process. Another trick is to surface the audit data in a way that feels like a conversation. Publish dashboards that let developers see how their changes shift the numbers in real time, and invite them to comment or propose mitigation.
I love that framing audits as a design time partner really flips the script. When you treat baseline metrics as living specs, they become a first-class citizen in the developer's mental model, not a post-mortem check. One thing that's worked for us is to embed those metrics directly into the pull request template. So when someone opens a PR, the checklist automatically pulls in the latest audit thresholds and even suggests unit test stubs to cover any gaps. It turns the audit into a dialogue that starts long before the code lands. The dashboard idea is spot on, too. I've seen teams build a lightweight audit scorecard that pops up in the PR diff view, highlighting how a change.
That's a killer move, basically turning audit into a living, breathing part of the code review workflow. Pull request templates that auto-inject the latest thresholds and even suggest stubs. It's the kind of frictionless automation that keeps teams honest without feeling like a chore. What I love most is the audit scorecard in the diff. When a change appears, you instantly see how it nudges the overall score, and the diff can even surface specific metrics that slip below the target. It turns a static checklist into a real-time conversation. Hey, this function now hits 80% coverage, but the complexity metric has spiked. Teams can then decide.
Absolutely, that's the sweet spot where tooling meets culture. When the audit scorecard pops up in the diff, it's not just a number, it's a dialogue starter. Developers can see, okay, coverage is up, but cyclomatic complexity just crept over the limit. That immediate feedback turns a passive checklist into an active, collaborative conversation. What's really powerful is that the scorecard can surface those outliers before they become blockers. Imagine a PR that passes all the usual tests but nudges the complexity metric past the threshold. Your team can pause, refactor, or add a comment explaining why the complexity spike is intentional. It keeps the codebase healthy without adding extra meetings. I'd love to hear how teams are.
That's spot on. Making the audit a living conversation instead of a silent checklist really flips the dynamic. In our own ship, we've turned that scorecard into a kind of code health bar that appears right next to the PR diff. Whenever the complexity bar nudges past the threshold, the bot drops a quick comment, heads up, cyclomatic complexity is 12, just over the 10-point ceiling. Do you want to break this into smaller functions or add an explanatory note? What's been a game changer is how we use the outlier flag to trigger a lightweight code health pause. Instead of pulling a whole squad into a meeting, the team can pause the merge, swap out a few lines, or even attach a short comment explaining a deliberate design decision. The result is a smoother flow and a shared mental model of what healthy means for our code base.
That's a brilliant twist, and it's exactly the kind of feedback loop we've been craving. Seeing the complexity bar in real time next to the diff turns a static audit into a live coaching session. It's like having a coach whispering in your ear every time a function starts to feel like a black box. What really hits home for me is that code health pause you described. Instead of the whole squad sprinting into a meeting, you're giving the team a quick, low-friction way to address the outlier on the spot. It keeps the momentum going, and it reinforces that we're all on the same page about what healthy looks like.
That's spot on. Having a live pulse on complexity is like turning a code review into a guided walk through the code base. It's the difference between a post-mortem and a proactive, real-time health check. And the Code Health Pause is a game changer. It's that quick tap and fix that keeps the sprint humming instead of stalling for a full-blown meeting. Speaking of real-time insights, have you been following the latest wave in observability tooling? The shift from traditional logs and metrics to full stack.
Absolutely, it's like moving from a black box to a full-screen HUD. The newest wave is all about full-stack observability that stitches logs, metrics, traces, and even events into a single, searchable fabric. Think of it as turning every component into a self-describing, real-time source of truth. One of the biggest movers right now is the adoption of tracing-first platforms. Tools like Tempo, Jaeger, and Zipkin are getting.
That's spot on. When you start treating traces as the core of your observability fabric, the whole system just becomes more coherent. Tempo, Jaeger, and Zipkin aren't just competing, they're actually complementing each other in a way that's reshaping how teams think about instrumentation. What's really exciting is how these tracing-first platforms are now pulling in not just traditional request/response flows but also sidecar telemetry, event streams, and even custom business metrics. The result? You can drill down from a high-level service health dashboard right into a single span that shows every downstream call, the latency it introduced, and the exact error that bubbled up. And because the data is now in a single searchable fabric, you can start correlating anomalies across the stack in.
Absolutely, and that's where the real power lies. When you're able to drill straight from a service-level health view down to that single, causally linked span, you're not just diagnosing a problem, you're uncovering the root of the latency chain. The beauty is that the same fabric that hosts your traces can ingest sidecar metrics and event logs, so you can see, for example, a Kafka consumer lag that's quietly creeping up behind a request that's already hitting your SLA. The next step for teams is to layer in automated anomaly detection on top of that searchable fabric. With a unified data model, you can feed a simple rule-based engine or even a lightweight ML model that flags when a downstream call's latency suddenly spikes or when error rates cross a threshold. Because all those signals.
That's spot on. Having that single, causally linked span as a pivot point turns a mystery into a measurable story. And the real kicker is how seamlessly the same fabric can ingest sidecar metrics, logs, and even Kafka lag. It's like having a backstage pass that lets you see every instrument in the orchestra, not just the main melody. Layering automated anomaly detection on top of that is the natural next leap. A rule-based engine is a solid baseline, but sprinkling in a lightweight ML model, say, a one-class SVM or even a simple LSTM for time series, can catch those subtle shifts before they hit the SLA. The unified data model is what makes it all possible.
Exactly. Once you've got that single, causally linked span as your anchor, the rest of the stack starts to feel like a well-tuned instrument. The unified data model is the score that lets every metric, log, and even Kafka lag play in harmony, so you're not chasing disparate signals in isolation. When you layer on automated anomaly detection, you're essentially giving the orchestra a conductor. A rule-based engine is great for obvious thresholds, but sprinkling in a lightweight ML layer, say a one-class SVM or a short sequence LSTM, lets you catch those micro shifts that a hard rule would miss. The trick is to keep the model lean so it can run in real time.
I love that musical metaphor. Seeing the stack as an orchestra really drives home how critical that single, causally linked span is. Once you've got that anchor, every metric, log, and even Kafka lag can be tuned to the same tempo, and the whole system starts to sing instead of just a bunch of soloists. Now, when you bring in the anomaly detection layer, you're not just giving the conductor a baton, you're giving the conductor a real-time score that can adapt. The rule-based thresholds are the sheet music's strict tempo markings, but the lightweight ML layer is the improvisational jazz solo that catches those subtle shifts before they become full-blown crashes. The key is to keep that ML layer lean enough that it can process the span data in the same heartbeat as the rest of the system. A one-class S.
Absolutely. Think of that one-class model as the backstage whisper that keeps the whole orchestra in sync. We're talking about something like a lightweight one-class SVM or an online isolation forest that can ingest the span metrics, heartbeat, and latency features as they stream in, without adding latency. The trick is to keep the feature set minimal, maybe a rolling mean, variance, and a few percentiles of the span duration, plus the correlation between parent and child spans. That way the model can run in microseconds, fitting right into the same tick as your observability pipeline. And because you're feeding it real-time data, you can drift adapt it.
That's a slick setup, essentially turning the observability stack into a real-time anomaly detector that never slows you down. I love the focus on the rolling statistics and the parent-child correlation. Those are the sweet spots where you get the most signal without blowing up the feature space. In practice, I'd start with a simple one-class isolation forest because it's embarrassingly parallel and can be updated incrementally, then switch to an online